"Get these butchers out of my sector." That wasn't a Viet Cong commander screaming in fear. That was a United States Army general. And he was talking about our own guys. Welcome to the war they didn't show you on the evening news. The war where the deadliest Americans in Vietnam didn't wear helmets. They didn't wear boots. They wore blue jeans, bandanas, and faces painted blacker than a nightmare. They were the Navy SEALs, the men with green faces. And the Pentagon brass hated their guts. Why? Because while the Army was playing by the rules, these guys were rewriting the laws of physics in the Mekong Delta. While the generals were obsessed with body counts and shiny medals, the SEALs were obsessed with silence. In this video, we are peeling back the classified files on the most vicious rivalry of the Vietnam War. It wasn't Americans versus communists. It was the suits versus the savages. We're going to show you the weapons the Army banned and the SEALs used to slaughter the enemy. We'll take you inside the Phoenix program, the CIA operation that turned the jungle into a hunting ground. And stick around until the very end, because I'm going to reveal the one incident that was kept quiet for decades. The night a SEAL team decided to teach an arrogant Army colonel a lesson he would never forget, by breaking into his bedroom without leaving a trace. You think you know military history? You have no idea. Lock and load. This is the true story of the ghosts of the Delta. The year was 1968. The setting was a United States Army forward operating base deep in the Mekong Delta. Inside a command module plated with corrugated aluminum, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat, cigar smoke, and the relentless fumes of a diesel generator chugging outside. Behind a desk buried under tactical maps and intelligence reports sat a brigadier general. His uniform was starched to perfection. The silver stars on his collar caught the dim light. His boots were polished to a mirror shine that could reflect a soldier's fear. His face was shaved smooth, adhering strictly to regulations that stretched from the Pentagon to the muddy trenches. This man was a veteran of World War II and Korea, a believer in order, discipline, and the chain of command. But on this humid afternoon, his carefully constructed world was cracking because 6 men had just walked into his office who looked like they had crawled out of a nightmare. These 6 intruders did not salute. They did not wear steel helmets. They did not wear standard-issue jungle fatigues. One man was dressed in blue Levi's jeans and a black civilian t-shirt. Another wore tiger-striped camouflage purchased on the black market in Saigon. Their faces were covered in days of stubble that was quickly turning into non-compliant beards. On their feet, instead of regulation combat boots, they wore canvas sneakers or coral booties. To the general, they looked like armed hippies who had escaped a rock concert to play soldier. But the most offensive detail was the weapon resting casually on one man's shoulder. It was a Stoner 63 light machine gun, a complex piece of hardware the Army had officially rejected as too high maintenance. These men were Navy SEALs. They were not here for orders. They were here to inform the general that they would be operating in his sector, on his territory, and entirely by their own rules. The tension in the room was sharp enough to cut skin. The platoon commander, a lieutenant not even 30 years old, stood with a relaxed slouch, his hand resting near a holster that contained a weapon designed to give Army supply officers a heart attack. It was the Mark 22 Model 0, known in whispered circles as the Hush Puppy. This pistol was equipped with an integrated suppressor and slide lock, built for the silent elimination of sentries and guard dogs. Regular infantry units did not have access to such technology. The CIA did, and the SEALs did. The general stared at them with a mixture of confusion and profound disgust, seeing not elite warriors, but a chaotic gang that threatened the very fabric of military discipline. But this visual insult was merely the spark that would ignite a firestorm across the entire command structure in Vietnam. To understand why a high-ranking Army general wanted to kick the Navy SEALs out of his sector, you have to understand the violent collision of 2 opposing philosophies of war. On one side stood the massive machine of the regular army, driven by General William Westmoreland's strategy of search and destroy. This doctrine was impressive on paper, but disastrous in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. It relied on a single, brutal metric known as the body count. Success was measured solely by the number of enemy eliminated. The more artillery shells fired, the more bombs dropped. The more square miles scorched with napalm, the closer victory was supposed to be. The Pentagon demanded numbers to feed the press and satisfy Congress. The Army believed in overwhelming force and sheer volume. A battalion of 500 men would thunder into the jungle, sweeping through grid squares with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and Huey helicopters screaming overhead. The noise was deafening. The dust clouds were visible for miles. If they took fire, they leveled the tree line with heavy artillery. Afterward, a report would be filed claiming a specific number of enemy combatants neutralized and the area secured. But a week later, the Viet Cong would return to the exact same position because territory without permanent occupation meant absolutely nothing. The enemy simply melted away from the noise and returned when the silence fell. But the SEALs operated in a completely different reality. A SEAL platoon consisted of only 14 men, often split into 2 squads of 7. Sometimes a mission required only 3 operators. They did not need tanks. They did not need artillery support. Often, they did not even want helicopters. They slipped into the operational area on small sampans or light fiberglass boats, navigating the labyrinth of the Mekong Delta in total darkness. Their objective was never to capture territory. Their goal was snatch and grab. They targeted specific individuals: a tax collector, a courier, a high-ranking political officer. One quiet abduction of a key Viet Cong leader provided more actionable intelligence than a month of blind bombardment. And this is where the hatred truly began. The general saw the war as a hammer smashing a rock. The SEALs saw it as a scalpel severing a nerve. When SEALs operated in an Army sector, they often refused to share their specific coordinates because they knew Army radio frequencies were compromised by double agents. To the general, this was mutiny. He had armed men roaming his battlefield whom he could not control, could not track, and could not protect. He viewed their silence not as tactical necessity, but as professional arrogance. And every time a SEAL team vanished into the night without filing a flight plan, the general felt his authority slipping away, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty that he could not command. However, the real nightmare for the Army brass was just getting started. The visual contrast between a regular United States Army soldier and a Navy SEAL in Vietnam was so extreme that it looked like 2 completely different species of warrior had been dropped into the same war. The Army was an institution of uniformity, a massive green machine where every button had to be buttoned and every boot lace tied exactly according to the manual. Even in the sweltering heat of Southeast Asia, where the humidity hovered near 100% and the sun baked the brain inside the skull, the Army clung to its regulations like a drowning man clings to a raft. A soldier was expected to be clean-shaven every morning. His hair was to be high and tight, fading to skin on the sides. His boots were to be black leather, polished to a shine that could reflect a sergeant's angry face. His uniform was the standard olive-drab jungle fatigues, heavy and hot. His weapon was the M16 rifle, jamming in the mud. Deviation was not just discouraged, it was punished. To the Army mind, discipline in appearance equaled discipline in fire control. The SEALs took that rulebook, doused it in gasoline, and set it on fire. They realized very early in the conflict that standard military issue gear was designed for a war in Europe, not for the amphibious hellscape of the Mekong Delta. So they started improvising with a radical freedom that drove the high command absolutely insane. And nothing infuriated an Army sergeant major more than seeing a SEAL operator walking toward a helicopter wearing a pair of blue Levi's 501 jeans. This wasn't a fashion statement or a teenage rebellion. It was a calculated survival decision made by men who lived in the water. The standard Army fatigue pants were made of a cotton poplin that, once wet, stayed wet for hours. In the constant immersion of the mangrove swamps, this led to severe chafing, fungal infections, and the dreaded jungle rot that could take a man out of action faster than a bullet. The SEALs discovered that denim was tougher. It offered better protection against the razor-sharp elephant grass and the endless swarms of leeches that infested the brown water. More importantly, wet denim was quieter than wet poplin. When you are stalking a sentry from 3 feet away, the swish of fabric rubbing against itself can be the difference between a successful takedown and a fatal firefight. So they wore blue jeans. They wore civilian T-shirts purchased in local markets. They looked like college students on a violent hiking trip, and the Army hated them for it. But the rebellion against uniformity didn't stop at the waist. It went all the way down to the feet. While the Army slogged through the mud in heavy, steel-plated jungle boots that made a distinct sucking sound with every step, the SEALs wore canvas sneakers or specialized coral creepers. These were lightweight footwear designed for diving, but on land, they allowed an operator to feel the ground beneath his feet. They could step over dry twigs without snapping them. They could move through the slime without getting stuck. They sacrificed the protection of a heavy boot for the silence of a predator. And then there were the faces. The SEALs grew their hair long. They stopped shaving weeks before a deployment. In a military culture that equated a clean face with professionalism, a beard was a symbol of anarchy. But again, there was a method to the madness. The facial hair helped break up the distinct outline of a human jawline in the shadows, making them harder to spot by enemy snipers. It protected the sensitive skin of the face from the blistering sun and the relentless insect bites. And psychologically, it terrified the enemy. To the superstitious Viet Cong, these wild-looking men with painted faces and long hair didn't look like the young American conscripts they were used to fighting. They looked like demons rising from the swamp. However, the clothing was just the wrapper. The real source of envy and rage for the regular troops was the hardware these men carried. Nothing symbolized the technological divide between the Army and the SEALs more than the weapon that became the icon of the Delta teams, the Stoner 63 light machine gun. The Stoner 63 was a masterpiece of engineering designed by Eugene Stoner, the same genius who gave the world the M16. It was a modular weapon system that could be converted from a rifle to a carbine to a belt-fed machine gun in minutes. It was brilliant. It was futuristic. And the Army absolutely refused to use it. Army Ordnance Boards tested the Stoner in the early 60s and rejected it, claiming it was too complex, too fragile, and required too much maintenance for the average grunt in the field. They wanted weapons that could be abused, dropped in the mud, and neglected, yet still fire. The Stoner was a thoroughbred racehorse, and the Army wanted a mule. The SEALs saw what the Army missed. They saw a weapon that weighed significantly less than the standard M60 machine gun, but fired the smaller 5.56 millimeter round at a blistering rate of nearly 1,000 rounds per minute. It was a handheld buzzsaw. In the close quarters ambushes of the Delta, where visibility was often less than 10 meters, you didn't need long-range accuracy. You needed a wall of lead. You needed volume of fire that could strip the bark off trees and suppress an entire enemy squad in seconds. The SEALs adopted the unwanted orphan of the Army arsenal. They loved the Stoner 63. They pampered it. They understood that if you cleaned it obsessively, and SEALs cleaned their weapons for hours after every mission, it would function flawlessly. When a SEAL platoon opened up with 3 or 4 Stoners simultaneously, the sound was distinct. It wasn't the slow thump-thump-thump of the Army M60. It was a continuous, tearing roar, like canvas being ripped apart by a giant. When the Viet Cong heard that sound, they knew they weren't fighting regular infantry. They knew the men with green faces had come for them. But while the stoner was the instrument of loud destruction, there was another tool in the SEAL inventory that disturbed the conventional soldiers even more. It was a weapon that whispered. It was officially designated the Mark 22 Model 0, but the operators called it the Hush Puppy. The name was a dark joke derived from its intended use to silence barking guard dogs that could alert a village to the team's presence. It was a highly modified Smith & Wesson Model 39 pistol, chambered in 9mm. But this was no ordinary sidearm. It was fitted with a massive integrated suppressor that looked like a thick black tube extending from the muzzle. It fired special subsonic ammunition, bullets that traveled slower than the speed of sound to avoid the telltale sonic crack that echoes through the jungle. The engineering went even further. The Hush Puppy had a slide lock lever. When engaged, this lever prevented the pistol's slide from moving back after a shot. This eliminated the mechanical clack-clack sound of the weapon reloading. It turned the pistol into a single-shot device that was virtually silent. At 15 yards, the only sound was the metallic click of the hammer falling and the soft thud of the bullet hitting flesh. To a regular Army soldier, raised on the concept of honorable combat and overwhelming firepower, the Hush Puppy was a ghastly object. It wasn't a soldier's weapon. It was an assassin's tool. It belonged in a spy movie, not on a battlefield. Seeing a SEAL cleaning this silent killer in the mess hall sent a shiver down the spine of the average infantryman. It was a physical reminder that these men were not fighting a war of attrition. They were fighting a personal, intimate war of elimination. They didn't engage the enemy, they deleted them. This arsenal, the blue jeans, the unauthorized beards, the rejected machine guns, and the silent pistols, was more than just gear. It was a declaration of independence. It was a message to the generals in their starched uniforms that the rules of war had changed, and the old guard was no longer in charge. The Army had tanks and helicopters and millions of dollars of artillery. The SEALs had a 6-man team in a plastic boat with customized weapons and a complete disregard for regulations. And as the war dragged on, it became painfully obvious which approach was actually working. But the visual rebellion and the tactical secrecy were just the surface layers of the conflict. The true rot, the thing that made the generals grind their teeth at night, was the dark alliance that allowed the SEALs to operate with such impunity. It was the shadowy hand of the CIA and a program that turned the war into a localized horror show. This was the program known as Phoenix, and it was about to take the rivalry from professional disagreement to moral outrage. But the conflict between the regular Army and the SEALs wasn't just about guns and denim. It was about who they worked for. To understand the deepest level of this hatred, you have to look at the Shadow War. The Navy SEALs in Vietnam were not just Navy assets. They were frequently loaned out to a much darker master, the Central Intelligence Agency. This partnership birthed the Phoenix program, perhaps the most controversial and misunderstood operation of the entire war. Launched in 1967, the goal of Phoenix was terrifyingly simple: destroy the Viet Cong infrastructure. Not the soldiers with AK-47s in the jungle, but the political shadow government that ran the villages. The tax collectors, the propaganda chiefs, the recruiters, the suppliers, the people who looked like innocent farmers by day, but ran the insurgency by night. The CIA built lists, long lists of names, aliases, and locations, and they needed someone to go into the denied areas and cross those names off. That is where the SEALs came in. For an Army general trying to fight a conventional war, the Phoenix program was a nightmare that destroyed everything he was trying to build. The Army strategy relied heavily on, quote, 15, winning the loyalty of the local population. Generals sent medics to treat village children. They sent engineers to build schools and dig wells. They held meetings with village elders, drinking tea and promising protection. They were trying to be the good guys, the builders, the protectors. They spent millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours trying to convince the Vietnamese peasants that the Americans were their friends. And then, the SEALs would arrive in the middle of the night. Imagine the scenario. An Army captain spends 3 months building a relationship with a village chief. They share meals. The captain trusts him. The village seems secure. Then, at 2 in the morning, a 6-man SEAL team, acting on intelligence from a CIA handler that the captain has never met, slips into the village. They bypass the Army perimeter. They don't ask for permission. They silently enter the chief's hut. They know what the captain doesn't, that the friendly chief is actually a Viet Cong paymaster. The next morning, the sun rises over a scene of confusion and terror. The chief is gone. Maybe he was taken away to an interrogation center in a boat. Maybe he was eliminated right there in his bed with a double tap from a hush puppy. The villagers are screaming. They blame the Americans. They don't distinguish between the Army captain who built the well and the men with painted faces who took their leader. In one night, 3 months of diplomacy are burned to the ground. The village turns hostile. The next Army patrol that walks through gets hit by a booby trap. The Army commanders were furious. They screamed that the Phoenix program was an assassination bureau running wild in their backyard. They argued that you couldn't win a war by terrorizing the population you were supposed to save. They called the SEALs mercenaries and gangsters who operated without accountability. They demanded to see the intelligence. They demanded to vet the targets. They demanded to know who was next on the list. But the answer from the CIA and their SEAL enforcers was always the same: silence. The intelligence was compartmentalized. The lists were classified. The operations were need to know, and the Army general did not need to know. This created a toxic atmosphere of suspicion. The Army felt like they were sharing their sector with a serial killer who happened to be on their side. They were responsible for the safety of the province, yet the most lethal actions in that province were being carried out by men they couldn't control. The effectiveness of the Phoenix program is still debated by historians today. The CIA claimed that tens of thousands of key Viet Cong operatives were neutralized, effectively decapitating the insurgency in many provinces. They argued that it was a necessary evil, a dirty war that had to be fought in the shadows because the conventional army was too clumsy to fight it. But the cost was high. The program was riddled with corruption. Local Vietnamese officials used it to settle personal scores, adding the names of their rivals or debtors to the CIA hit lists. Innocent people were targeted, and every mistake, every wrongful abduction, fueled the hatred of the local population against all Americans. For the SEALs, however, it was just the mission. They didn't make the policy. They executed it. They were the tip of the spear in a war that had no front lines. They prided themselves on their ability to go where the Army couldn't, to do what the Army wouldn't, and to strike fear into an enemy that had laughed at American air power. They saw themselves as the ultimate professionals, doing the hard, ugly work that kept the Viet Cong awake at night. But to the Army general sitting in his air-conditioned trailer, looking at the angry reports from his field commanders, the SEALs were something else entirely. They were a cancer in his command. They were rogue elements that undermined his authority and endangered his men. He wanted them gone. He wanted them court-martialed. He wanted them leashed. He didn't realize that the genie was already out of the bottle. The era of the mass army was dying in the rice paddies of Vietnam. The era of the special operator was just beginning. And the friction between these two worlds was about to produce a spark that would explode into one of the most legendary, untold stories of the war. Yet, the tension wasn't just institutional, it was personal. The rivalry became dangerous when the ego of the officers got involved. There were incidents, hushed up, buried in paperwork, never spoken of in official histories, where Army commanders tried to sabotage SEAL operations. Not directly, of course. That would be treason. But in the subtle, bureaucratic ways that the military excels at. A request for a helicopter extraction might be delayed due to maintenance issues, leaving a SEAL team stranded in enemy territory for an extra 4 hours. A supply request for specialized ammunition might get lost in the system. Artillery support might be denied because the coordinates were uncertain. These were petty, vindictive moves. They were dangerous games played by men who felt their power slipping away, and the SEALs, being who they were, did not take it lying down. They kept their own score, and they had their own ways of settling debts. One particular story, whispered in the bars of Saigon and passed down like folklore among the teams, perfectly illustrates this breaking point. It involved an Army colonel who decided that he was going to be the one to finally break the SEALs. He was a man who loved his regulations more than his country. He despised the beards, the jeans, and the attitude. He made it his personal mission to make life miserable for a SEAL detachment operating near his base. He cut off their access to the base exchange. He restricted their movement through his checkpoints. He publicly dressed down a SEAL officer in front of his men. He thought he was teaching them a lesson in discipline. He thought he was showing them who was boss. He didn't understand that he wasn't dealing with soldiers. He was dealing with a different breed of animal entirely. He pushed them too far. And one night, the SEALs decided it was time to push back. They didn't file a complaint. They didn't call the Inspector General. They decided to launch a special operation. The target was not a Viet Cong bunker. The target was the colonel's own secure compound. This brings us to the edge of the most shocking revelation of the rivalry, a moment where the war against the communists took a pause and the war between the American branches turned hot. It is a story of infiltration, humiliation, and a message delivered in the dead of night that changed the power dynamic forever. Because when you declare war on the ghosts, you have to be ready for them to haunt you in your own home. If the institutional conflict was a burning fire, there was one man who poured gasoline on it every single morning. His name was Richard Marcinko, but the teams just called him Dick. He was, without a doubt, the most notorious, scandalous, and effective commander in the history of the Navy SEALs. He arrived in Vietnam in 1967, leading 2nd Platoon, SEAL Team 2, with a reputation that preceded him like a hurricane warning. Marcinko was the son of Slovak and Czech immigrants from a gritty coal mining town in Pennsylvania. He grew up fighting, he enlisted fighting, and he came to the Navy with a philosophy that would later become his legendary motto: wars are not won by signing papers. In the chaotic theater of Vietnam, Marcinko unleashed his full potential. He personally led his platoon on night raids deep into the Mekong Delta, conducting dozens of operations under the Phoenix program. He was wounded in action, earned the Silver Star, and collected 4 Bronze Stars for valor. But his primary weapon against the Viet Cong wasn't just his rifle or his knife. His most dangerous tool was an absolute blinding contempt for bureaucracy. He viewed the rules of engagement not as laws, but as suggestions for people who didn't want to win. Marcinko became a nightmare for the military police and the base commanders. He started brawls in officers' clubs where he wasn't technically allowed to be. He famously, quote, which is a polite Navy term for stole, Army jeeps and trucks because he felt the naval supply chain was moving too slowly for his liking. He once told a senior officer who tried to interfere with his operational planning to go to hell, and he did it in front of witnesses. When an Army colonel demanded a detailed after-action report for a midnight raid, Marcinko reportedly told him that the colonel could write the report himself because he was too busy preparing for the next mission. To the old-school generals, Marcinko was the embodiment of everything they hated about the special operations community. He was the antithesis of military discipline. He was chaos in human form, a loose cannon rolling on the deck of a ship in a storm. And yet, the most unbearable part for the brass was that he delivered results that no conventional battalion could match. Marcinko's single platoon, operating with just 14 men, eliminated more high-ranking Viet Cong cadres in a 6-month tour than an entire infantry brigade did in a year. This created a paradox that drove the command structure insane. They couldn't punish him because he was a war hero. They couldn't ignore his results because they were desperate for victories. And they couldn't force him to play by their rules because the CIA protected him. The only thing the generals could do was scream into their telephones, demanding that someone remove this wild man from their sector. But the screaming didn't help. Marcinko was not just a rogue operator. He was part of a system that had gained too much momentum to be stopped. However, the legend of Quote 5 was only one face of the terror that the SEALs brought to the Delta. The other face was the silent, creeping horror they inflicted on the enemy every single night. To truly grasp the scale of the psychological warfare, you have to understand how the Viet Cong viewed the night. For decades, the guerrillas had owned the darkness. They knew that the American Army was a daylight force. During the day, the Americans had helicopters, jet fighters, and artillery spotters. The sky belonged to them. But at night, the helicopters were blind, the jets were grounded, and the artillery fired blindly into the jungle. At night, the Viet Cong moved their troops, laid their mines, attacked outposts, and vanished before dawn. The night was their sanctuary. It was their advantage. It was their home. And then the men with green faces arrived and took that home away from them. The SEALs were nocturnal predators by choice and by training. They prepared for missions by sitting in total darkness for hours before deployment, allowing their pupils to dilate to the absolute biological limit. They didn't rely on early primitive night vision scopes that washed out with the slightest light. They relied on their senses. They learned to see movement in the shadows. They learned to distinguish the sound of a human footstep from the sound of a wild pig. They learned to smell the enemy, the faint odor of a charcoal stove from 300 yards away, the smell of fermented fish sauce from 200, the metallic scent of gun oil from 50. The Viet Cong discovered that the night was no longer safe in the most brutal way possible. SEAL teams began penetrating their base camps with a stealth that bordered on the supernatural. Guards on the perimeter saw nothing. The village dogs, usually the best alarm system in the world, remained silent because the SEALs masked their scent or used the hush puppy to quietly remove them. There were documented cases where a SEAL squad would slip into an enemy encampment, locate the commander sleeping in his hammock, and extract him without waking a single other soul. The next morning, the guerrillas would wake up to find their leader gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints in the mud. He had simply vanished. It was as if a spirit had come down and taken him. This was the beginning of a psychological war that the SEALs waged with as much skill as they waged the shooting war. The fear of ghosts spread through the Viet Cong ranks in the Delta like a plague. Guerrillas who had endured B-52 airstrikes without flinching began to fear the silence. You can hide from a bomb in a tunnel. You can hide from a helicopter under the canopy. But you cannot hide from a man who is standing 3 feet away from you in the pitch black, a man you cannot see, hear, or smell. Some SEAL teams amplified this terror intentionally. They started leaving calling cards on the bodies of their targets or on the empty hammocks of the men they abducted. The most famous was the Ace of Spades. In Vietnamese culture, the spade was a symbol of bad luck and death. Leaving a playing card on a corpse sent a clear, chilling message. We were here. We stood over you while you slept. We could have taken you all, and next time, we might. The effect was devastating. Viet Cong discipline began to crack in the sectors where the SEALs operated. Guerrillas refused to sleep in their base camps. Commanders changed their locations every single night, exhausted and paranoid. Sentries fired their weapons at every rustling leaf, terrified that a green face was coming for them. Every time a nervous guard fired into the darkness, he gave away his position. wasted ammunition, and spread panic to his comrades. The enemy was eating itself alive from the inside out. The Army Command observed this disintegration with mixed emotions. On one hand, any damage to the enemy was a good thing. On the other hand, the methods used to achieve it were so alien to the Army doctrine that they felt wrong. The Army believed in crushing the enemy's will with overwhelming firepower. The SEALs were crushing the enemy's mind with silence and fear. The general could not bring himself to admit that 6 men in blue jeans were achieving a psychological victory that his entire division of tanks and artillery could not. To admit that would be to admit his own irrelevance. And in the military hierarchy, irrelevance is a fate worse than defeat. But historical truth does not care about a general's ego. And the truth was on the side of the SEALs. By 1971, as the main SEAL forces began to withdraw from Vietnam under the Vietnamization policy, the results were undeniable. In the provinces where the SEAL platoons had operated, the Viet Cong infrastructure had been decimated. The tax collectors were gone. The recruiters were hiding. The political officers had fled to Cambodia. The guerrilla movement in the Delta had lost its leadership spine. This victory wasn't won by massive sweep operations. It wasn't won by carpet bombing. It wasn't won by holding territory. It was won by small groups of men who mastered the environment, turned the enemy's tactics against them, and brought a terrifying new form of warfare to the jungle. The Army never officially credited the SEALs with turning the tide in the Delta. The reports were sanitized. The credit was given to quote 16 and quote 17. But every soldier who served in the brown water knew the truth. The war had spoken, and its message was silence. But the conflict between the establishment and the elite did not end with the withdrawal from Vietnam. In fact, it was just the opening chapter of a much longer story. The rivalry between the conventional mindset and the special operations mindset is a permanent feature of the American military. Every time a general asks for more tanks, a special operator asks for better night vision. Every time the bureaucracy demands more paperwork, the elite units demand more speed. Vietnam was the crucible where this friction first sparked into a raging fire. And the Navy SEALs, those 6 men in jeans with beards and silent pistols, were the first warriors of the future. They proved that a small team of highly trained professionals could achieve strategic results that an army of thousands could not. No matter how loudly the generals screamed, they couldn't drown out the effectiveness of the silent option. But there was one final act in this drama that needs to be told, a story that brings us back to the personal vendetta between the Army brass and the Navy rebels. A story of a polite lesson that went down in history as one of the most audacious, non-lethal operations of the entire war. Because you can't suppress the truth forever, and you certainly can't suppress a SEAL team that has decided to teach you a lesson. The breaking point arrived on a humid Tuesday night in late 1969. It didn't happen in a firefight with the Viet Cong, but over a crackling radio frequency that carried a death sentence from an American officer to his own countrymen. A 6-man SEAL team, deep in enemy territory near the Cambodian border, found themselves pinned down by a battalion-sized force of North Vietnamese regulars. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. The team leader, a seasoned chief petty officer, keyed his radio and called for immediate artillery support from the nearest Army fire base. It was a standard request, a lifeline that every American soldier relied on. But on the other end of the line, the voice of an Army colonel, a man who had made his hatred for the quote, _0_ publicly known, denied the mission. He claimed the coordinates were unverified. He claimed his guns were busy with other priorities. He told the operator that the Navy would just have to swim for it. The message was clear, quote 1, for 4 hours. The SEALs fought for their lives in the mud. They used every trick in the book, every grenade, every ounce of their training to break contact and slip away into the mangroves. They survived, but only by the skin of their teeth. When they finally limped back to their base at dawn, covered in slime and blood, they were not just exhausted. They were cold with a rage that no court-martial could ever satisfy. They didn't file a formal complaint with the Judge Advocate General. They didn't write a letter to their congressman. They decided to deliver a lesson in professional courtesy that the United States Army would never forget. The plan was simple, audacious, and strictly off the books. The target was not an enemy bunker complex. It was the heavily fortified Army base commanded by the very colonel who had left them to die. This base was a fortress, surrounded by triple coils of razor wire, guarded by watchtowers with 50 caliber machine guns, and patrolled by sentries with attack dogs. To the Viet Cong, it was impregnable. To the SEALs, it was just another puzzle to solve. The operation commenced at 2 in the morning, the darkest hour of the night. The SEAL team, dressed in their signature tiger stripes and face paint, approached the American perimeter not with weapons of war, but with tools of silence. They moved like ghosts through the elephant grass, slipping past the outer listening posts without disturbing a single blade of vegetation. When they reached the wire, they didn't cut it, which would leave a trace. They slithered under it, moving inches at a time, their bodies pressed into the mud. The first obstacle was a roving patrol of 2 young privates. The SEALs shadowed them for 10 minutes, learning their rhythm, their boredom, their blind spots. Then, in a coordinated blur of motion, they struck. There were no shouts, no struggles, just a sudden pressure on the carotid artery, an expertly applied chokehold, and the sentries slumped unconscious into the arms of the men they were supposed to be guarding. The SEALs bound them with zip ties, gagged them with duct tape, and left them gently propped up against a sandbag wall. They were not hurt. They were just paused. Deeper inside the base, the team moved with terrifying confidence. They bypassed the motor pool. They skirted the mess hall. They reached the helicopter landing pad, the pride of the colonel's command. With methodical precision, they placed dummy explosive charges, blocks of wood painted to look like C4 plastic explosive, on the skids of every single Huey gunship sitting on the tarmac. On each block they painted a simple message in white letters: Boom! If this had been a real raid, the colonel's entire Air Force would have been turned into scrap metal in seconds. But the true objective was personal. The team leader and his point man located the colonel's private quarters. It was a comfortable trailer, air-conditioned and separated from the enlisted men's tents. The door was locked, a laughable barrier to men who picked locks for a living. They slid inside. The air was cool and smelled of aftershave. The colonel was asleep in his bunk, snoring softly, safe in the knowledge that he was surrounded by a battalion of infantry. He was the king of his castle, until he wasn't. The colonel woke up to a sensation of heavy pressure on his chest. His eyes snapped open, adjusting to the dim light. What he saw stopped his heart cold. A figure in black, face painted like a demon, was sitting on top of him. A gloved hand was pressed firmly over his mouth. The eyes behind the camouflage paint were not angry. They were dead calm. The SEAL leaned in close, his lips inches from the terrified officer's ear, and whispered a single sentence. Quote 9. The hand released his mouth. The figure stood up and melted back into the shadows of the room. By the time the colonel could scramble for his service pistol on the nightstand, the room was empty. The door was closed. The only proof that it hadn't been a nightmare was sitting right there on the table next to his lamp. It was the safety pin from a flashbang grenade, a small metal ring that said everything that needed to be said. The next morning, the base woke up to a scene of absolute humiliation. The sentries were found tied up but unharmed. The helicopters were found destroyed by wooden blocks, and the colonel was found in his quarters, pale and shaking, staring at a grenade pin. He understood the message perfectly. His fortress was an illusion. His authority was a joke. and the men he had tried to kill had held his life in their hands and given it back to him as an act of charity. He never denied a SEAL request for support again. But this raid, this Operation Courtesy Call, was more than just revenge. It was a symbol of a much larger shift that was tearing the old military apart. The Army relied on walls, on numbers, en masse. The SEALs proved that walls meant nothing if you couldn't see what was coming. They proved that a small group of highly trained experts could dismantle a large, clumsy system from the inside out. It was a humiliation of the highest order, a triumph of skill over rank, of the operator over the bureaucrat. And as the sun set on the Vietnam War, that lesson began to sink in. The generals eventually lost their war. The strategy of body counts and massive firepower failed to stop the communist tide. The United States withdrew, leaving behind a legacy of frustration and broken doctrines. But amidst the wreckage of defeat, something new was born. The reputation of the Navy SEALs did not suffer from the loss of the war. On the contrary, it exploded. The stories of their exploits, the silent raids, the impossible rescues, the terrifying effectiveness of the men with green faces became the foundation of a new American military identity. The Pentagon, for all its stubbornness, could not ignore the data. The future of warfare was not going to be fought by massive armies clashing in open fields. It was going to be fought in the shadows by small teams with surgical precision. The very methods that the generals had tried to ban, the stealth, the unconventional weapons, the autonomy, became the gold standard for the modern age. In 1987, the United States Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, was born. It was the ultimate victory for the ghost soldiers of the Delta. The chaotic, rebellious spirit of the SEAL teams was formalized into a global strike force. Today, when a president needs a problem solved quietly, he doesn't call a division of tanks. He calls the descendants of those men in blue jeans. From the raid on Osama bin Laden to the hostage rescues in Somalia, the DNA of the Vietnam SEALs runs through every modern special operation. The generals who screamed, "Get them out of my sector," are long gone, their names forgotten, their strategies buried in dusty archives. But the legacy of the men they hated lives on. They were the outcasts, the rebels, the unwanted, and they became the elite. So the next time you see a Navy SEAL in a movie or hear about a daring raid on the news, remember where it all started. It started in the mud of the Mekong, with a Stoner 63 in one hand and a middle finger raised to the establishment. It started with a war within a war. And in that war, the guys in the blue jeans won. This is the story they didn't want you to know. But now you do. And history is written by the winners, even if they have to break into your bedroom to sign it.